Welcome to This Explainer. Napoleon Bonaparte is usually held up as this absolute visionary, right? One of history's greatest military minds who completely reshaped Europe. But today, we're going to break down that romanticized myth. We're looking at the chilling, unvarnished facts of the 1799 Jaffa campaign, diving into a much darker side of his legacy that definitely doesn't get the same enthusiastic spotlight as his battlefield victories. So it really begs the question, do we truly know the man behind the myth? As we go through this, I want you to consider something. Does the celebrated glory of these massive empires, the grand narratives of conquest and reform, actually blind us to the horrific human costs paid to build them? Well, we're going to look at one specific event that forces us to confront this exact, really uncomfortable reality.
Section 1, The Myth of Napoleon and the Dark Side. Let's get right into it.
There's a pretty stark contrast we need to look at here. On one hand, you have the traditional legacy, the stuff you probably read about in school, the enlightened reformer, the military genius, the guy who gave us the Napoleonic Code. Basically, the ultimate man of discipline and vision. But contrasting that, we have the architect of Jaffa. This is from the 1799 French campaign in the Ottoman Levant. And look, this wasn't just some harsh military decision made in the heat of the moment. It was a mass atrocity, one that completely shatters that polished image of the quote-unquote enlightened hero.
Moving on to Section 2, The Fall of Jaffa and the Broken Oath.
Okay, so to understand the inciting incident here, we really have to follow this fatal tactical sequence. It's like a domino effect. First, during some earlier battles, French forces captured a bunch of defending soldiers. Now, step 2. Instead of holding them as prisoners, the French actually struck a deal. The prisoners took a solemn oath not to fight against the French again. Step 3. Based entirely on their word, they were released. But then we hit step 4. When Napoleon's army later captured the city of Jaffa, they found out that some of these exact same men had taken up arms against them again.
And that brings us to the crucial concept of the broken parole. Napoleon saw this recapture as a direct, completely unacceptable betrayal. In his eyes, these guys broke their word, which proved to him that his previous act of mercy was a total failure. They simply couldn't be trusted. But here's the thing. Instead of just identifying and punishing those specific individuals who actually violated their parole, Napoleon's reaction escalated. It escalated into this massive, collective, and frankly brutal retribution against thousands of people.
Which brings us to Section 3, Days of Massacre and Terror.
Between 1,500 and 5,000 men, that is the estimated number of unarmed prisoners executed under Napoleon's direct orders. And it's absolutely vital to understand the context here. This was not heat-of-the-moment combat. Not at all. These executions happened after the city of Jaffa was already completely secured and under French control. These men were captive, and they were entirely unarmed. The historical accounts of how these executions were carried out are genuinely horrifying. They weren't quick and they weren't orderly. The officers actually wanted to save ammunition, which is a chilling detail, so that led to prisoners being executed by bayonets or even by drowning. And because of these methods, the massacre wasn't just a single momentary event, it dragged on for several days. Sources literally describe this as an extended act of terror. To make matters worse, as the executions prolonged, military discipline within the occupying force completely broke down. Widespread civilian looting, theft, and violence tore through the city, which meant that women, children, and non-combatants suddenly found themselves caught up in this deadly chaos.
So how did he explain this? Section 4, Napoleon's Logistical Justifications.
Napoleon actually offered a highly practical defense for his actions. He argued that his army was deep in hostile territory, they lacked the food to feed thousands of extra prisoners, and they simply didn't have the guards or transport to manage them while keeping the campaign going. Basically, it's the classic defense of necessity in war. But the overarching consensus of historians totally rejects this logistical defense as a valid excuse. They don't view this as a regrettable necessity of war. Instead, they see it as an act of calculated terror and deliberate mass murder against fully disarmed victims who couldn't fight back.
And this jarring duality really defines his legacy. As historians have noted, when facing obstacles, he was capable of choosing terror as a solution. It just goes to show that the image of a highly civilized, enlightened leader often stood right alongside acts of extreme, deliberate cruelty. Whenever he faced a tough logistical or strategic hurdle, Napoleon proved he was perfectly willing to deploy absolute terror to solve it.
Let's look at Section 5, History's Verdict on the Massacre.
The events at Jaffa leave us with some really crucial takeaways.
First off, it completely shatters that enlightened hero myth that constantly surrounds Napoleon. Instead, it exposes the raw, ugly price of conquest. It proves that incredibly powerful men, even the ones we celebrate for their genius and vision, have an immense capacity for horrific crimes. Ultimately, studying an event like this forces all of us to take a much more honest, unromanticized look at what empire building actually requires.
So, the crucial point we need to take away here is that Jaffa acts as a kind of historical anchor. It forces us to confront the brutal truth that great conquerors are very often responsible for profound moral failures. The supposed glory of empires are almost always built on a foundation of intense human suffering. And that completely breaks apart those romantic, glossy stories of destiny we hear so often.
Which leaves us with this final thought. Can genius truly be separated from brutality? When we look back at the annals of history, at massive figures like Napoleon, who literally shaped the modern world through brilliant strategy and vision, can we ever disentangle that brilliance from the terror they inflicted? It's a heavy question, but it challenges the very way we write and understand history. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking the hard questions, and I'll see you next time.